Hi, I'm Keegan. This is Bunch of Gamers. Just me today, as I wanted to talk about some house rules about Werewolf 5th that I had come up after running a couple sessions a few weeks ago. This is just one way of doing things, and I'm sure there are more extensive changes that could be done. I played with the idea of making bestial failures only happen on ones so people didn't have to buy a whole new set of specialty dice, as that did come up in the game, as someone brought vampire dice and then found out that the hunger dice didn't quite work for Werewolf 5th. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this, and quite frankly, I'm not all that interested in fixing all the issues that I took while running this game to make it just kind of fun for me and my groups. Last thing, this won't really be importing any sort of lore or changing the write-ups of several of the tribes, since some of the tribes, especially if it's trying to import legacy material, are out of my lane, and others would require just more work once again than I'm willing to put in. All the tribes as written are playable and are mostly fine from a mechanical point of view, and if you want to know more of our other issues, I will link the video where I spoke to James and Josh about Werewolf 5th edition quite extensively. With all that out of the way, here are 9 house rules for Werewolf the Apocalypse 5th edition. Character creation. This one's pretty straightforward. It's a house rule that I've actually used in all my World of Darkness 5th games, and it's this. A player can choose to take 5 advantages and no flaws, and take an additional dot of advantages for every flaw they take, up to 2. I've said this before, but with so few flaws and many of them just not being of any interest to myself or my players, this gives them the option to work in flaws or just not have them and have just a few less advantages. It works out quite well, and my players like it. Channeling Rage. Rage is a power that's meant to be channeled. All the same rules for bestial failures, constructive and destructive actions remain until we get to auspices later on. And instead of rage dice replacing normal dice, players can channel their rage in a similar fashion to blood surges in V5. Make a rage check. Regardless of pass or failure, you add your current rage to the die pool you're channeling. If the initial rage check fails, after the roll, you reduce your rage by 1. So an example would be, let's say my character wants to punch someone. I have 4 rage, and I choose to channel that into my punch. I roll my rage, and I fail. I add 4 dice to my strength plus brawl, and then after the action's complete, my rage is now 3. Finally, in Krynos, rage is automatically added with no rage check needed, as the Krynos form is the unbridled rage form, making auspices matter. This is a 2-phase approach, and this is the one that probably needs more thought and probably more testing in the battlefield. But the idea is that your auspice will affect your starting rage. At the start of each story, an auspice starts with the following rage scores to represent their closeness to Luna and their internal rage. Ragabosh and Therges start with 1 rage. Philodoxes and Galliards start with 2 rage, and Arun, of course, start with the most, 3. The next is to make sure each auspice is actually good at what they're supposed to do in their society. The book gives you suggestions of how to play them, but those are just suggestions. You could be just a full-on combat Philodox if you wanted to, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I'd like there to be more meat to my auspices. So, instead, I've decided that they get exceptions to how they channel rage, as we saw above. So the Ragabosh, as a trickster and questioner of ways, are excellent at finding flaws and are excellent at deception. When a Ragabosh channels their rage, they treat these actions as if trying to cause harm or damage, or as what I've been referring to them as destructive actions as shorthand, for the purposes of adding additional successes to their roll rather than bestial failures. So if a Ragabosh is sneaking, if a Ragabosh is trying to find a flaw in an enemy formation, they can channel their rage, and if they roll a bestial failure, it's actually treated as a critical success rather than an automatic failure. Therges are the auspice that has the greatest aptitude with spirits and the Umbra. So any action in dealing peacefully with Gaian spirits or summoning them are treated as destructive actions for the purpose of their additional successes. This is the one that I think needs the most thematic work, so if you have better ideas, leave them in the comments below. But as lawgivers, Philodox are supposed to be able to be mediators and dispense punishment to those who break Garu law. Thus, the Philodox is able to channel their rage when mediating disputes or making sure that people speak in turn, and for when they are dispensing punishment to Gaia and Garu, specifically, who have been judged to be violators of the litany. Just to make sure that they're not just Arun 2.0, I narrowed the scope to Gaian Garu in my thinking, since, in theory, right, Black Spiral Dancers and possibly the Cult of Fenris are consistent litany breakers. Galliards are supposed to be historians, singers, and storytellers, and so real easy. They can channel their rage to recall the lore of their tribe and of general Garu history, and that they're able to perform that for inspiration and to draw upon the ancient songs of their audience. Lastly, the Arun. Since the Arun's purview is war and a lot of rage channeling is to cause harm, I've expanded that just a little bit. That the Arun is able to channel their rage into any violence. So there's a sniper rifle example in the book where careful aiming and things like that make it so that it doesn't count as a destructive action for having rage apply to it, but that doesn't apply to the Arun. The Arun can be a sniper, they can craft bombs, setting up ambushes. These are all destructive actions. The Arun as the ultimate warriors of the Garu. Shapeshifting. Failing a rage check with Rage 1 feels bad in W5. It's not fun, in my humble opinion, and it's an easy-to-fix issue, I think. When the player shapeshifts, they still make a rage check. If the player fails, they now have options. They can choose not to change at all, but keep the same rage score, or change and reduce their rage by 1. It's simple, it frees up the player to try and shapeshift desperation while still feeling dramatic at times and without them feeling stupid for trying. For the Krynos form specifically, the player still makes 2 rage checks. If both go off as successes, the player just shapeshifts as normal. If only one is successful and the other is a failure, the player can spend 1 point of rage to shapeshift, or spend an additional action unable to move as they slowly shift into Krynos. And finally, if both rage checks fail, the player can spend 2 rage, be stuck in Hamid or Lupus, or if things are truly desperate, they can enter a frenzy as they've tapped deep into their rage and they have failed. Finally, I would update Krynos to only check for frenzy if they hadn't attacked something in the previous round, rather than if they hadn't killed anything the previous round. I would give them the option to spend willpower to automatically overcome the frenzy, just like the rules, or use the frenzy rules that I will talk about in just a little bit. This allows the game to be less punishing and allows you as the storyteller to throw a big bad at your players without having to throw in a few minions to make sure that the players don't get knocked out of Krynos, or make it so that they're fighting a big bad and Krynos is just the least effective form to fight it in, which I think is wild and not thematically on brand for what even the book's trying to go for. Stepping sideways. I would recommend just doing away with taking damage from being in the Umbra too long. If you want a hostile Umbra and expand upon the Guile's Howl issue, though, I would recommend giving all your players all 5 points in the Umbral Traveler lore sheet for free. I would give the Garu also the innate ability to step sideways into the Umbra. After being stated to be half spirit, the inability to deal with that half of themselves doesn't really make sense to me. All players get a variation on the rite of shadow passing, where the player rolls their 2 highest renowns in an attempt to step sideways. Players can still channel rage, but a bestial failure always leads to damage as per the rules written in the Rite of Shadow Passing. I would still allow the Rite of Shadow Passing in the game as well. It would be an option for players to spend experience to carve out a niche as an Umbral Specialist, as it costs significantly less experience to max out the roll of 1 renown and occult than it does to max out 2 renown. Rights. Add an additional die for each Garu participating in the rite beyond the Rite Master. They must be Garu, but they do not require rage. However, add 1 additional rage die for each additional pack the Rite Master is not a part of that's participating. This is so rage, which is more anger focused than spiritual focused, isn't as tempting to channel into a rite. And it creates a bit of danger for lots of Garu to work together still, as more and more Garu join. But you also only risk a brutal outcome if 3 packs are working together. And finally, reduce the number of rage dice by 1 that are added to a rite roll if all the packs involved are part of the same sept. Septs are supposed to be areas of community, and having that reduction and being connected to the same sept patron, I think, is a way to really drive that home and drive kind of a sense of connected struggle to some of the NPCs. Touchstones. Touchstones should reflect the animistic beliefs of the Garu, and the easiest way to leverage that is to allow the players to take on spirits, humans, wolves, and locations as touchstones. This gives them a connection not just to people, but things they are fighting for in the apocalypse, and creates interesting story hooks for the players. Is a character willing to kill to protect a specific park that gave them a firm connection to nature growing up? To hold human, wolf, Gaian creatures, and spiritual entities as equal can really drive home the specific themes and beliefs that the Garu have, and that it removes that sort of human-centric view that has been imposed in Werewolf 5th that I think detracts from what made Werewolf interesting in the first place. Finally, once per story, the player can spend significant time with a touchstone and remove a point of Hirano or Hoglosk, rather than shift it as rules is written. Werewolf should be about fighting against an unjust world, raging against injustice, and possibly losing yourself to the fight. But it's also a game about connections, and how those connections can keep us in the fight without losing ourselves to it. Hirano and Hoglosk. Oh, fuck. This is longer than I expected. I didn't know I had this much to say still. Anyway, as mentioned in the interview with James and Josh, this tracker is flawed. The dichotomy between depression and fascism doesn't really hit well for me. So this is just a simple reframing of the stat without actually having to change any of the rules around it. Hirano is then closer to one might consider burnout. The fight has taken its toll on the Garu. They find the effort to fight back exhausting. It becomes more why bother, and a kind of hopelessness or even doom scrolling rather than it is true depression. Perhaps this is a bit of wordsmithing, who knows, but that's more of what I want to drive with what Hirano is. Hoglosk, I would actually draw closer to Vampire the Masquerade's The Beast. It's unbridled rage that lashes out. What makes a Garu under Hoglosk more terrifying than a vampire in full thrall of the Beast, however, is the ability to speak, to seemingly have the ability to reason through with logical leaps and animalistic passion what they're doing is just, to be thrown into anger, to just feel the weight of the world on you and lash out. More importantly, though, while a PC might be temporarily unplayable if either meter is filled, they are redeemable with efforts from other Garu. If redemption is explicitly possible for the Black Spiral Dancers, a creative choice I agree with, then it should be possible for those who have fallen under Hoglosk, and the Cult of Fenris by extension. Frenzy. Final edition is, of course, Frenzy. Frenzy should absolutely be a constant fear for the Garu, as their rage should be a double-edged sword, and that it can wildly burn out of control. Frenzy can happen because a touchstone or something else the character cares about deeply is being threatened. Any sort of situation where humiliation is so great it actually deals a point of aggravated willpower damage. Or the Garu failed to attack anything the previous round in Krynos. Regardless, the player must now roll willpower to avoid a frenzy. The difficulty is their rage. Obviously, characters cannot channel their rage for this roll, and that means that while 5 rage is very good for combat, if you are unable to attack an opponent for whatever reason, that becomes a hindrance, right? That's a difficulty 5 roll with however much willpower you might have left because you don't want to spend it and you want to take the risk. Or even if you take aggravated willpower damage, a difficulty 3 or 4 roll might guarantee a frenzy, and I think that makes it so players are more likely to lean into actually managing their rage in more interesting ways. But anyway, those are my house rules. I hope you enjoyed them. These haven't been super play tested, and honestly, they're more of a jumping off point for a lot of you rather than a destination. I hope you like them, and if you got a favorite, let me know. If you plan on trying them out, let me know. And I'll be honest, this will probably be the last conversation I have about Werewolf 5th, just because Werewolf 5th doesn't really interest me that much. So I'd rather spend my time either running games I like or talking about games I like. So with that, till next time, bye.